Hi, everyone. Hello, happy Monday. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 685th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Zoe Leonard, Tim Johnson, Thyrza Nichols Goodeve, and Esther Gabara. We're thrilled to welcome poet Josephine Shokrian here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for actual necessary decolonial work, but a reminder of place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land that we're speaking from. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guests and host. New York-based artist Zoe Leonard balances rigorous conceptualism with a distinctly personal vision in her work, which merges photography, sculpture, and installation. By employing strategies of repetition, shifting perspectives, and a multitude of printing processes, Leonard's practice probes the politics of representation and display. Leonard explores themes such as gender and sexuality, loss and mourning, migration, displacement, and the urban landscape. Her photography specifically invites us to contemplate the role that the medium plays in constructing history and to consider the roots of contemporary photographic culture. Based in Texas, Tim Johnson manages Marfa Book Company, a bookstore, art gallery, and music venue. Professor Esther Gabara works in the Department of Romance Studies and Art History, and Visual Studies at Duke University. She was curator and editor of the exhibition and accompanying catalog Pop America 1965 to 1975. She's the author of Errant Modernism, The Ethos of Photography in Mexico and Brazil, and Non-Literary Fiction, Art of the Americas Under Neoliberalism. And writer, editor, artist, and interviewer Thyrza Nichols Goodeve writes with rather than on contemporary art and artists. She was senior editor at the Rail from 2017 to 2019, and the Rail's lucky to have her as an editor-at-large. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to pass it over to you, Thyrza.
Thank you, Chloe, and welcome everybody. If you could bring up the first image. So this is a particular pleasure of mine because Zoe and I did a conversation for the Rail in 2018 for her exhibition survey that was at the Whitney Museum. This is one of the images from it. It's her picture, How to Take Good Pictures, a piece that I bellowed with laughter when I walked in and saw it. I also just want to take note that it also has a river in it. Today, we're here to talk about a project that is so vast, so important, and so encompassing of issues that in an hour we will only be able to just, pinprick what is going on. But like when I saw Survey, where I went, what is this as a show, as an installation? It wasn't just a solo. I went in looking at it as a solo exhibition, and it's so much more than it's a work of art that she talked about it, that the installing is. The same with the project called To the River, which is, I'll let her describe the background, but a project she's been working on for five years, and is also genre defying. I feel like all of her work, and also like a river, it doesn't stay in one place. You'll see that we're going to talk about various iterations of it. There is a show up currently in Paris. There was a smaller version of it at Hauser and Wirth. We're going to talk about the incarnation of it as a book. This is a project that has 1,000 life forms. Where I'm so happy that we have Tim here, because Tim is the person who edited the volume of text that go along with the book, which we will talk about as well. And Esther is obviously our shining expert on this area of Latin American photography, on issues around the border, and so on and so forth. So before we get into it, I do want to mention that my title of the survey show came from Fred Moten's wonderful essay in the survey catalog for the Whitney. And he calls her the philosopher of the sequence out of sync. And I continue to think that that is one of the great ways to talk about Zoe, and I will just leave it at that. I won't try to go into it, but I think it's a beautiful way of going in. I think what we're also going to be doing today is, if you could show the next slide, we're going to be thinking about the way that Zoe's photography is always asking us to unlearn and re-see and see again, and that, as she says, the politics of there is a politics in all of our viewing. And in the book, I thought this was a way to set up our conversation. In the book, one of the essays is by Ariella Aisha Azoulay, and it's this fantastic, history of photography, starting with it as the invention of the New World and the invention of photography are not unrelated. Next slide, please. And one of the great sentences, imagine the origins of photography go back to 1492. I think this is a wonderful way also of talking about the river. One of the essays in the book talks about how the river for 99%, the Rio Grande, for 99% of its life had no name. And what the To the River as a project does is shows us, the complexity of the river as a built environment, as a history. You'll see there'll be images of levees and irrigation ditches and bridges and so forth. But I think situating it as a project that's about photography, about unlearning ways of seeing. And I'll read the quote now. If you could go back to the other quote, sorry, I should have read it. What would this mean? It's not about questioning the exact moment of the inception of photography and proposing that it was the optical device or that chemical substance that made it possible. It is about questioning the political formations that made it possible to proclaim and institutionalize the idea that certain sets of practices used as part of large-scale campaigns of imperial violence are separate from this violence and unrelated to it, to an extent that can even account for it from the outside. Next slide. Among these imperial rights, and this is where you see the river, are the rights to destroy existing worlds. The river had an existing world forever, which is part of what we see and don't see in Zoe's project. The right to manufacture a new world in their place, rights over those whose worlds are destroyed together with the rights they enjoyed in their community, and the right to declare what is new and consequently what is obsolete. So also part of the unlearning process of this magnificent project is unlearning modernism and modernity and colonialism. If we could go to the next slide, please. So Zoe, that is sort of a way of opening this up. I think for those who are watching this, if you could give us a brief introduction to how this project evolved, and then tell us about the extent of it, because it is more than just well, anyway, you go on, you tell us about the project. Sorry.
Hi, Thyrza. Hi, Tim, Esther, Chloe, everybody. Okay, well, El Rio to the River really, it centers on the river, but I focused on the 1,200 miles of the river that are used by both Mexico and the United States of America as the international boundary. So I photographed along those 1,200 miles, not the full length of the entire river and not the full length of the entire border, but the 1,200 miles where the river is used as a border. But the work really begins with this question for me of what does it mean to ask a body of water to perform a political task? And I think wrapped up in that question are a multitude of other questions, which are really about a human relationship to the rest of the world, the entire rest of the world that we inhabit, all the other species and all the landscapes and all the other phenomenon that are going on around us. As you say, as you bring up, the river predates human existence. It's millennia old. The river has its own sovereignty and its own logic. The water that composes the river comes up from the earth and down from both sides of the watershed. And in that sort of gathering of water, there's a force that has both responded to the landscape and changed the landscape. So a river is a really unique kind of body of water. And I think it also holds tremendous metaphoric possibilities, as well as all of the sort of facts of the river.
So could you, sorry, I'm going to be interrupting at moments because we have so much to follow through. So if you could talk about it as an artwork, and this is partly what I want us to talk about, because there's so many issues around the river and the border and history, but then just the management of it as an artwork. Here we're seeing one image. I found it impossible to think of finding any one. Obviously, there's over 500 images, right? So that's why, and so talk about the different iterations of it in different museum shows and so on and so forth. And one other thing I want to mention is in our conversation from 2018, you talked about how installing for you is super important and exciting, and it's part of your, so that each installation of this is another artwork, it seems as though, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the river is a great subject, but that's only maybe the starting place for any artwork. So it was about 4 years of photography, taking pictures, many thousands of pictures, and spending an enormous amount of time looking, observing, photographing, traveling. That was about 4 years. Overlapping with that was a process of editing, which was about 2 years. And then it was 16 months of printing, the finished edit. And then there's the process of installing, which is ongoing. So it's, we just, the show in Paris just opened a couple of weeks ago. And so that was a kind of whole rethinking of the work and how the work would sit in that context. So I'm going.
And how many photographs are in that show?
I don't think I'm going to give an exact number. I don't have an exact number on
Okay.
hand. I also think that it's several hundred.
Okay.
And I think that in each location,
Exactly.
tailoring it to the spaces, and but it's a work of epic length. There's a lot of photographs. And in Paris, I think there are a number of things that sort of inform how I installed it there. There's the physical space, which is this kind of the top floor of the Musée d'Art Moderne, which has this incredible kind of arc. So there's some very long galleries, and then this beautiful long arc, and then a number of kind of more rectilinear rooms. And the circulation there, you begin and then you go all the way around, and then you come out kind of where you've begun. So it's a circular. So that determined a lot about how I wanted to handle the space. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So it's really directional. It also sits in the city of Paris, right along the banks of the Seine. So I think while this particular artwork, my subject is the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo River, many of the situations and configurations and power dynamics that I encountered and that I am exploring through various languages of photography are kind of questions and issues that echo globally. Questions about water use and the rights of who uses water and how we feel we can, about land rights, about climate change and drought, and also about immigration, borders and boundaries, questions of policing and surveillance. So the tremendous sweep of this subject allowed me to engage with any number of different contemporary issues through the use of the language of photography. And to really, as you said, I so appreciate how you introduced the nature of looking and the nature of the medium of photography as something that can construct and can also deconstruct or unbuild. The Borderlands region is an area that is, broadly speaking, we're talking about a very, very large area of land, is under heavy surveillance all the time and has been photographed in a number of different ways over the last 150 years. So it's not new to bring a camera at all. And in fact, I felt the weight of all of that and sometimes thought this was a really bad idea. Like, what good could ever come of bringing another camera? But what I was looking at, I think, and the way that I worked with photography was an attempt to not only see some of the photographs that hadn't been taken, but also to wrestle with that history. How had this region and this set of situations been so overexposed and yet also so oversimplified? So I was looking for the kind of spaces and beats between things, the complexity of the situation, if you will.
Would you talk a bit about how you install the photographs and your choices?
Sure.
How you put them on the wall?
The work is organized in passages or sequences of photographs. Some are single images, many are groups of 5 or 7 or 12 or 30. And so there's a kind of relationship to cinematic frame, movement, image coming on image, where either the photographer, me, the camera's moving through the landscape, or some action is unfolding in front of the camera. So I think there's an explicit engagement with the idea of framing and a foregrounding of what is being framed, and therefore calling attention to what is not being framed. In Paris, I think the negative space it's very spacious. There's a lot of photographs, but it's a 12,000 square foot space. So even though there's a lot of photographs on the wall, there's also a lot of wall between them, and there are benches and places to sit, and there's a real flow to how the body can move through space. So the idea was to also imply all of the things that are not being seen, and to give the viewer space for their own thoughts and their own movement and their own kind of agency as they progress through the exhibition.
Which is what you did with Survey as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that notion of spaciousness and especially the photographs having so often, seen as these sort of spectacles we stand in front of. With yours, there's a movement both within the image and from image to image, but it's never about leaving behind the specificity of the one image. If we could keep going for a second. I guess, no, maybe go back a second. Where was the one, maybe 8? Next one. Yeah, like this. Look at this. Yeah, this is very cinematic. This is the other thing too, as we've talked about. Yeah, there's many species in this book. There's birds, there's goats, there's cows, there's people. People have mentioned that this is about life. This is living. This is a living organism, and the way you have them almost here, yes, as film stills, and it's just, this is like a beautiful little poetic essay, right? I mean, that's the impossibility of talking about this project. It's at the same time the wonder of talking about it is that there are so many of these little moments. Maybe this is the point to go to the book, if we can, as another iteration of the project. I am a big fan of this book. It's 2 volumes. It's a volume of images, as well as a volume of text that Tim, who is going to be speaking in a moment, put together. I think how to go. I could talk for a long time about what it was to sit through. Several times I've gone through this book page by page. It also has to do with the design. But so for instance, so this is just, but now, this is just another iteration of a project. And what I loved about it is that so often exhibitions are very hard for all of us to go to and to see, and say, for the one in Paris, I can't get to, I would love to. And here, everybody has access. Everybody can go at their own pace. So I was struck by, and we're just going to go through for the viewers, just some of it. We can't go through all 300 pages, but this is how it begins, right? And these, to me, this was very pre-Socratic. I kept thinking of like these very early, pre-Socratics talking about the evolution of form, right? And here it was the river. It almost looked like Vaseline too, right? And so this turgid kind of primordial. So you are telling a story, very much, right? With these. So these go through for the first 10. Then if you could go to 13 for a second, Chloe, thank you. I know this is going to be. So these all are parts of the book. So here's like the sort of the iconic picture, right, of the river that one would think of. And I noticed you have that on your Instagram, or one similar to this. And there's several that are. So when people think of the river, that's what they think of the river. But then if you go to, and I think we'll jump now to page 33 to 37. And I'll ask you to talk about this image sequence. Because here is the river too. Where is the river in this? And what are we seeing? And talk about the layout of the book, if you will, and then how the following pages emerge, and what are we looking at?
That's a great question. Where is the river in this picture?
In a lot of the pictures, yeah.
In a lot of the pictures. And that's a question I asked myself as I was starting the work. Starting to photograph, I asked myself, do you always have to see the water in every photograph? Yeah. And what I came to was that I was really moving through a larger riparian corridor, which is the landscape that is both formed by the river and that the river follows, that the river directly influences in some way or other, and where the built environment directly around the banks of the river intersect with the river, shove the river, move the river, engage with the river in some way. Some of the human built environment around the river has to do with irrigation, using the water from the river for human needs. What be they individual water consumption or large-scale agriculture or development. Some of the infrastructure has to do with the movement of goods, with commercial, with trains and bridges and roads. Some of it.
Is this the wall? Is this the famous wall?
This
or
is
not?
A part of one of the fences, yes.
One of the fences,
So,
okay.
yeah, some of the infrastructure has to do with various walls and fences that are built to control the flow of people. This particular section of fence or wall, I mean, there's a whole kind of story I could go into and talk about. But yeah, this is a privately funded section of wall, and you can see through the sequence of photographs. If maybe we'll just go through them, and can you start over and we can just look at them, and yeah, let's just go through them. So the river is less than 100 yards away from where I'm standing when I'm taking these photographs. And this, yeah, the next spread, if you want to go to that, that's a boundary marker that's referred to as boundary marker 1. And it marks the point where the the job of boundary is passed from a line on land to the central channel of the river. So this is the shifting point. Westward of this boundary marker, the border is marked with similar monuments all the way to the west coast. But from this marker onwards, the deepest part of the central channel of the river is the political boundary that's been agreed upon by the two countries. So in following the river and photographing the river, what comes into the frame ends up being all of this human built environment, because so much of our because humans have settled by the river for so long. So there are thousands of years of human engagement with this body of water. And there's been a tremendous uptick in the amount of built environment that has kind of been constructed in the last few years. But many of the fences and walls predate the Trump presidency. Many of them have been built over the course of the whole last century practically.
Well, and these are important because they show the interaction of people and the river as a place of swimming and as leisure, but within the backdrop of the mountains and the various built environments. Yeah. But it's very much a social environment, because I guess I haven't read much of the press, but I think Tim said that some of the press talks about there's no people in your book.
Yeah, this is a really important sequence, I think, in the whole
Hauser and Wirth, right?
Yeah, I did show this passage at Hauser and Wirth, and it's also in Paris. I think it's one of the really important sections, and where it falls, the logic of the work, the work moves from that juncture right around the very early part, which is like boundary marker 1, El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. And then you move downstream in the direction that the river moves all the way through to the Gulf. And this is the first instance where there are a lot of, where there are people visible in the landscape. And for me, it not only fell out that way, there are many other ways I could have started it. I wanted the first image with people in it to not be the expected image of people crossing or trying to cross, or migrants crossing, or of people being arrested, or of any of the number of contemporary images that are sort of drilled into us, from mainstream media. But to visit this very real thing, which is that, like, on a hot day, this is a day at the beach. And in Juarez, this is the beach. This is like where you go to swim with your family, with your friends, with your kids, with your parents, whatever it is. And despite the enormous amount of infrastructure that's very unwelcoming, the fences and the barbed wire and this kind of dam and the boundary markers and all of that, nevertheless, there are people swimming and playing and getting in the water. And that was really important to me, that was a tone and a possibility that could be opened up, again, in kind of unbuilding the expected images.
So Chloe, if we could jump then to 151. For some reason, this is a sequence I really loved, and I'll talk about it. Okay, and this is hard to see on Zoom, but if you're looking at it as a book, you're looking at the image and you're seeing obviously the landscape, you're seeing the river, but then you see this chapel. Is it a chapel, a church in the background there?
It's a church.
And for some reason, what is it?
It is a church, and it's a large one. It's bigger than a chapel. Yeah.
It's in
landscape. Colonial era.
I don't know why it made me. I had such delight when I saw it. It was this sense of of a different kind of built environment, the memory of that built environment over the river. And then as the sequence continued, I became even more sort of delighted and fascinated by how that same church becomes part. Okay, so it's still in, you can still see it in these images. And is this the Linda Bridge? Is that what it's called? Or the Linda?
The La Linda Bridge, yeah.
And I only know this because in here, this is a shout out to Alvaro Enrique, who has an essay in the book called The Abduction of America that is absolutely, absolutely astonishing. Everyone should read it. And I didn't know what it was, and then I looked it up. And so there's a whole history to that. I mean, again, can only show, we cannot get to the complexity, but you can still see the church. And I don't know, do you want to mention briefly the La Linda, that history? Look at it, because what is that? Because when we're looking at the book, I didn't know what it was. It looked like a bridge to nowhere, right?
There's a very, very long history, and I could really go down a rabbit hole.
Right.
This is a place that I'm fascinated and obsessed by. And Tim, I can see Tim laughing because Tim and I, it's
Right.
every time Tim has accompanied me on many of my the photography trips, and it's always when we talk about where we're going to go, I'm always like, well, Tim, I really want to come back to La Linda, because so much is so there are so many signs of different kinds of human history here. And I think that what you zeroed in on, I'm so happy because I'm always like, can people see it? Do they see it? Is that there's this other human history, which is embedded in this landscape now, which is the history of a colonial taking of land and a colonial genocide, and that the sites of violence are not only in the present day, but there are many, many layers of histories here of ways that of extractive economies and the kind of cumulative cost of those extractive economies that sort of undergird where we find ourselves now. And so this was another kind of unbuilding picture by really looking at the complexity of this built environment, saying like, well, where we didn't end up where we are now with the kind of harshness of border politics. This is something that has been contested, and struggles that have been engaged for a couple of thousand years. So having that colonial era church in the background, it sparked something for me when I first saw it. We're actually coming out of, well, that's a whole other story, but it was a rafting trip. What you can see here is that there is in fact a bridge. You can see at the center of it a boundary marker. If you zoom in, that kind of obelisk form, that the boundary monument sort of in the middle of the bridge there. And if you go to the one on the right, actually, you can see it right there in the center, that obelisk. So this is one of the you see these boundary markers or boundary monuments in many of the photographs, and there is always one at the center of a bridge marking where the international boundary is. And then you can see that from one side, the bridge has been closed. To talk about, I mean, we could do an entire NSE just on the La Linda and the kind of implications. There's a story about mining, there's a story about extractive economies, there's a story about drug trafficking, there's a story about people being murdered, and then there's a story about a kind of desolation. And then there's also a kind of what might have been, which is this idea that has been put forth by many different people, that this could in fact be the gateway for an international set of protected lands that would be like an international park, because there are millions of acres of protected land on both sides. And this bridge could be the gateway if these two countries would work together on it. So much meets here, from the geologic time of these amazing like rock formations all the way up to the current day of this sort of, what I see is a complete failure of imagination and a kind of failure in our human capacity to see possibilities for connection and strengthening each other rather than kind of division and alienation and distance.
Beautiful. Thank you. Well, because of time, so for all of you, that's just a little treat. That's just sort of part of the book. We could keep going, but we're going to stop now because you brought up Tim Johnson, who's here and who I know has been so much a part of your journey in this. And I'd like to bring Tim in now and have Tim talk about your history with the book. Obviously, you can't talk for very long, but as I said, the texts that are in it. So why don't you, what you could talk about is in your introduction, you talk about that you structured this as a method in a way, not just a structure. And maybe you could talk about because the texts are in one slipcase, the photographs in another, and it is a great way. And having read both and gone through the book, it does work really beautifully, back and forth. So.
Sure. I'm going to start by just sort of reiterating something you said, Thyrza, at the beginning, that like this, the river is multiple, right? It's both itself, it is multiple. It has the possibility of braiding into multiple channels. It exists above and below the ground. It exists with humans and also before humans. And to a pretty large extent, I think Zoe and I thought from the beginning that the river was not just a subject, but also a kind of protagonist. And that it was also just the river, right? And that it wasn't just about like trying to come to some understanding of the river so that we could kind of like, sort of solidify it into some sort of like known single entity, but how to appreciate sort of like sensorially this multiple entity that exists sort of in a kind of state of multiplicity. I think that in thinking about what we would do with the book, you realize that this river also exists in an environment that's been very much constructed, and how we know the river is very much constructed by a bunch of kind of disciplines, and that have a kind of both physical, it results in a kind of like built environment that's both literal and also figurative. And that, the Aujale essay is quite an excellent one. And another aspect of that essay that I think is important for what I'm about to say is that she also says that, we live now in a kind of regime of knowledge that's about disciplinarity, right? And the disciplines of geology and archaeology and history and also photography and poetry and so forth. And that those were developed very specifically in a history that related to like older forms and also still present forms of interconnected knowledges. And that this disciplinarity sort of produced kind of expertise regions, and for geology, all these different things, that also created a kind of like exclusive vocabulary for those things, and also institutions which are hierarchical. And in breaking up the interconnected forms of knowledge, they also broke aspects of the communal formation that existed, right? And also created all kinds of rights and wrongs in relationship to how we know what exists and also how we know each other. So this book is sort of about the fact that we do have disciplines, that there are people who work very specifically as journalists or as archaeologists, as poets, as historians and so forth. And yet we went to people who are working in such a way that they recognize this sort of built legacy that they inherit, but as they work within these disciplines, they're kind of working beyond them in a very social way. And they're also, I feel like for each of them, there's as much like unbuilding as there is building going on in their work at large. And in that sense, like they're sort of inspiring to us just as people working in the cultural field, but also they're people who helped us to understand the river better, or more broadly or deeply, in this sort of multiple way. And another aspect of the sort of method or whatever, that the sort of form of approach to the river as this multiple entity was also recognizing that there's aspects of knowledge which are like hidden from us, or which are unbuilt into the main sort of body of knowledge. And an important one to talk about here, because Esther's with us, though there are of course others, is that, Zoe and I, though I've lived on or near the border for most or all of my adult life, and I'm interested in photography and poetry, the actual amount of theoretical or historical information that I know about Latin American or Mexican photography is pretty limited. And also the number of photographers who have worked in this field is limited. Of course, I know great ones, but I know that also there's a lot that I don't know. And we sort of wanted to explore that fact and also why that, or how that came into being. And so with the help of another friend, Jaime Iglesias Lucan, we asked, who should we talk to that we might create a kind of bibliography about, books that, and also just photographers or histories of photography that people might come to know in order to encounter all of this work, El Rio as well as other work, in a better way, but also in a way that can sort of address, why individually these things have come into being, right? How it's come to be this way. And so then we talk about translation and all these other, questions. And so it's, in a way, it's like a bibliography, but it's also a conversational one, and that the individual participants in this conversation, Esther Gabara, Roberto Tejada, Jaime Iglesias Lucan, and Nadia Rivera Fela, are all talking about their own relationship, the particular photographers or photo books that have been interesting to them, and how photo books in particular have had a kind of political kind of modality in sort of photo culture and sort of larger political culture as well.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. So perhaps this is where, Esther, you can enter in now. You obviously have a huge expertise. So I guess for the purposes of this conversation is to situate Zoe's project within the context of your own research, as well as the conversation you had with Tim. And thank you for being here, Esther.
No, it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you and reconnect. And that's been the experience I've had of this invitation, is, reconnecting with Roberto, who I've known for decades, and with you, Thyrza, and now getting to know Tim and Zoe. It's interesting. There's been a couple of words that have come up that I feel like underline a shared understanding of what we do with photography and what photography does. Just in the lead up to this, but I started my work. It's interdisciplinary work between literature and, I guess, a version of art history through photography, through my first book, which was my dissertation on, it was called Errant Modernism. And it was really an archival project excavating what the really important role of photography in the avant-gardes in Mexico and Brazil. Really was a set of questions, and it really, I came upon this idea of errancy. It's a verb in Portuguese, errar, which means both to kind of wander and to get it wrong. And it's a verb that was used by one of the key figures in Brazilian modernism. And it really became the concept that guided my understanding of what was happening on the colonial side of coloniality modernity, right? Is a kind of the wandering, the sequences maybe that Zoe was talking about, that movement, but it's a movement certainly erring, but intentionally, consciously getting European modernity wrong, right? Not because you messed it up, but you messed it up on purpose, right? And so I traced that, and I think that there's a shared feeling. I hope you don't mind, Zoe, telling me that you got your photographs wrong, but I think that is a shared sentiment. And so that part of the getting it wrong was messing up the difference between what we might call documentary and fine arts photography. Part of getting it wrong, part of that errancy, it really intersects with the Azulé project about coloniality, modernity, getting gender, race, and those key concepts in modernity wrong. Back in 1931, Salvador Novo called photography La hija pródiga de las bellas artes, the prodigal daughter of fine arts, right? So there she is, sort of wandering out, not a prodigal son, but a prodigal daughter. And this is 1931. And so some of this was also my experience as a graduate student delving into this archive and speaking with an art historian who who would say to me, really? They wrote that in 1928? Really? They made this photograph in 1931, and where? In Mexico, right? So that sense of, well, we have to just know that it's wrong for that history of photography that you would have gotten in almost any history of photography class that you would have taken. And one of the things that was part that I kind of came to at the end of errant modernism was a concept of, and this is where I loved Zoe's talking about our failure of imagination and the need for greater imagination, was a chapter on fiction that turned into this new book that's coming out now on fiction. So part of this was making an argument for photographic fictions that were not faked or just intervened, although those did exist in the 20s and 30s, these ghosts, photographs of spirits and distorted photographs, but an idea of kind of photographic fictions that ultimately led me to think about fiction more broadly in contemporary visual art, right? What is a fiction when it's not narrative in nature? So that's to say, even though this new project is not about photography, sort of thinking about photography as this ground zero, as this, what Azalea talks about as photography being invented in 1492 is still there, right? Is that, if we are going to be striving for a critique of modernity, coloniality, kind of cannot avoid passing through dealing with photography and it's the ways of looking that it requires. So that's, I guess, a kind of very fast overview of 20 some years of research.
Fantastic. If we can go to the slide of the quote that I chose from Esther. Yeah. So here is, I'll just read it. The presence of the border in both national imaginations is absolutely fundamental. In a way, it designs the photographs to be taken. Once we don't assume that there's documentary photograph versus art photography, a posed photograph versus a captured photograph, the border is the condition of making photographs, which is a really interesting way to frame Zoe's project. And we have a couple of images that maybe you want to talk about.
Sure.
Chloe.
Yeah. I mean, I think the best way to do that, I think I know what's going to come up now. I had the real pleasure of working with Luis Garza, Colin Gunkel, Amy Scott, and John Noriega on, those photographs, okay, on a really important exhibition of La Raza, which was a exhibition of a very important photographic magazine in the Chicano movement in the 60s and 70s. It was so let me see where we can go with this. If we can go to the photograph where you see the water, the street under the water, there we go, on the right. Well, the right one is what I was thinking, but they're obviously a series. So, so I was really struck too by what Zoe said about the river being drafted into performing a political function, right? Which I started thinking about with what I was writing for La Raza, this catalog and exhibition, which included in one of the issues of the journal, a very funny kind of board game designed by a Chicano artist, a cartoonist, a writer, that showed in part the border town of El Paso, and also showed a sign referring to the Treaty of Chamizal. So that was in 1963, where a region of El Paso, what happened basically is the river moved, and the river moved permanently enough, right? The protagonist that Tim was talking, the river as a protagonist, in this case as a political protagonist, it took another path, right? And the Mexican and US government spent, I think, almost a century debating what to do about this decision the river made. And then in 1963, they came to an agreement, which, I'm getting back to this, looking at the border from Mexico's side would have been a victory, right? They finally got the US to cede the land that belonged to Mexico, right? And so that, Lyndon Johnson goes and he shakes hands with the president of Mexico, with Adolfo López Mateos, returning the chamizal to Mexico. Well, and what the problem is that there were people who lived in this neighborhood, and they were Chicanos, right? They were Mexican Americans, and the idea that the river's path, which was it was going to take, had resulted in this double exile, this continuous exile of a group of people who lived where they lived, right? Who were borderlands residents. There was no outcome that would benefit them, right? And so, in a sense, that story seems present in this photograph to me, right? In that, what I see when I look at that is obviously a borderline, a path underwater. We see the river expanding. We see the river leaving its borders, its boundaries, its banks. But to me, it's also, I've done enough, and a lot of you have done enough darkroom work, that you see it as a kind of image appearing in the chemicals, right? In the darkroom, right? So the image, the border is an image. The image is an image of the border becoming image, right? Through this kind of river liquid space. And so, yeah, I think that all of that is present in this one image, but it becomes very, I think it's what's important to me is that it's very grounded. It's not an idea of an image, right? It is the image making itself present, and the violence that we know is involved in that making process, right? And Zoe's discomfort of taking yet another image, right? So I think I've talked for a long time, so I should probably.
Why don't we just go back to the
Can I jump
sequence?
in on
Yeah.
one thing about that, because I think it's so interesting that you bring up chamizal, especially after all the super beautiful things about errancy and the idea of echad. I mean, all that was so amazing. And actually, with chamizal, from my understanding, what was actually interesting is that the river there was basically an island in the center of the river, and
Yes.
sometimes the river, the main channel, would go on the north side of that island, and other years it would take the south side. So this island of chamizal was, because the border had been tagged to the deepest part of the main channel, the border kept shifting to either side of this island. But the island wasn't moving, and the river was doing what rivers do. That is, in the nature of a river, it is in fact, it is not errancy for a river. That's like the way a river, the technical term actually is meander. Like a meander is actually a technical term for what rivers do. So I wanted to introduce this other idea.
Yeah.
Part of what happened with that, the desire of both governments to like stabilize the boundary. There was a systematic number of construction projects and this is the word I want to get to rectify the river. And it's literally called the rectification of the Rio Grande. And it's the building of a series of canals and channels and concrete beds that move the river out of its original riverbed into this concrete channel so that it remains constant, so that it can perform this job of border. So I think I love that you brought up chamizal, Esther. It makes me so, because this was like when I started reading about that area, because we'd been photographing that trench. It blew me up. I was like, the rectification, this word became one of the words that haunted the project throughout, because the idea rectify comes from, to correct something. So the human conception was the river was doing something wrong and needed to be corrected to meet human needs. And this became one of the words that Tim and I spoke about a lot when we talked about language and the kind of poetics of language and the importance of certain word constructions, and the kind of parallel language of photography and the construction of image. And I think it was so amazing that you went to this photograph and found that kind of errancy in this image. So
absolutely. If you don't mind my saying, because it's also, I believe it's in language around the same project. We were, and Zoe and I were really taken by the discussion of the meandering vagrant river, right? So like vagrant carries the same thing you're talking about with errancy. It's like definitely moves into a kind of moral, political, and criminal kind of condition that sort of you can feel as functioning structurally as a sort of justification for the kind of increase of ideas of the perceived need to control flows, and that the river is to some extent responsible in a state of vagrancy for flows beyond the control of a kind of rational understanding of property and so forth. And those are words that come back again and again. Meandering is a quite of interesting sort of median term, but certainly errancy and vagrancy being co-present terms in most instances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely fascinating. And it was Cordova Island that was divided between the two countries, right? And it's really interesting that you talk about the kind of moral valence, because in this very funny comic that I identified in La Raza, it's supposed to be a game that you play, and you're supposed to look for good Mexicans versus bad Mexicans, right? So it's already that idea of there being a moral imposition that legitimated the making vagrant of people who were residents, right? I mean, the vagrancy was imposed, it was exile, right? Rather, in other words, in terms of the people who resided in this neighborhood and were given the option of either going to Mexico or going to another part of the United States, right? They were converted into vagrants, right? Instead of from their homes. So, and the US press, the English mainstream press, characterized the chamizal as semi-abandoned sites of illicit activities filled with Mexican squatters whose citizenship was unclear, right? There was nothing unclear, right? So that's why I kind of went, for me, errancy, it's like a claiming of a wrongness, right? That to reveal the leverage of that moralism that's being projected onto the others, what would be kind of like the other side of the coloniality modernity space in the struggles that modernity imposes, right? So yeah, I mean, I love the meander idea, and that the river really is this protagonist. I think there's a lot of wonderful work going on now about non-human personhood that really sustains a deeper even reflection on how to start to even think about the river in those terms. So great.
Which makes me think of the beautiful photographs of the birds there's goats and dogs and so on and so forth. But we saw that sequence earlier that from the installation that I don't know if you can find it, Chloe, that was so extraordinary, of the irrigation ditches and the birds taking off, which again, all the many different lives around this river. I mean, as I said before, the profundity of this project is overwhelming and gigantic. And I just want to put out for the world right now that I can't wait for this project to also, it was here at Hauser and Wirth, but I can't wait for it to come to the United States into some institution where we all can also, East Coast, West Coast, Mid Coast, South, wherever. I think it should be a traveling exhibition. I'm sure you would like that. And that this notion of, made me also think of the way the installation, we are meandering. You are always creating meanderers throughout it, Chloe. But again, yeah, this is the sequence, this beautiful sequence of the non-human inhabitants. And then just the way that you've created this little poem of images. Oh my gosh, this also makes me think of, I guess this is, we're at 2 o'clock, amazing. I'm always amazed one can do all of this in an hour. But you can see the sky here, and very much part of what the river is very much the sky as well, and the different locations and the different horizon lines that you see in this. And so maybe to end, I just thought it would be interesting to go to the last slide that we have, just to let people know that also at the end of this wonderful book is a transcript, and maybe have Tim and Zoe talk about how you use the radio and the crossing of the border and music and the kind of river of music and all of these things. I love the fact that this was how the book itself ends, and maybe just talk to us about, because it's about, again, creating these communities across, defying border. Sure.
You know, early when Zoe and I started working together, she knows I've spent a lot of time on the river and in the border region, and I'm a poet, and she asked me, you know, who were some of the great poets she may not know, and there was a list, and some of them are in the book. But it also seemed pretty obvious to me that this incredible history of music, which is made in the north of Mexico and the southwest of the United States, is an important part of the poetic history and reality of this place. And I also have been for maybe 12 or 13 years co-hosting a radio program on public radio here in Marfa, Texas, a show called Dos Horas con Primo Carrasco. So it's 2 hours every Tuesday. And we're based in West Texas, but in the nature of radio signals, even though the FCC and so forth would like to control them, they get into Mexico as well. So our listenership is all over the west of Texas and also the north of Chihuahua. And our show, it consists of songs that we choose, pretty much all Spanish language, but some kind of like Tejano and Chicano songs, or some also in English. But they're songs that we choose, and also a lot of songs that are requested by our listenership. And our listenership is on both sides of the border. So for this book, we asked our listeners over several weeks if they would like to hear a song dedicated either to themselves or to someone they know, and that we would include that dedication and the name of that song in this book. And we also, of course, included those on the air as well. And in a way, it's sort of like the bibliography that Esther and Roberto and Aime and Nadia provided. It's a kind of list that gives an indication of the nature of the culture in this place, but it comes from voices. It comes from forms of relation, right? Which exist and have existed. And as you can, like in the songs there, or in the dedications here, you have people dedicating songs to family members who live on one or the other side of the river. And we have former mayors of Ojinaga in the state of Chihuahua dedicating songs to friends of his who live in the outskirts or so it was a way of, I mean, it's just a part of the reality that above this river, like you're saying, in the air, are all these sort of sound waves that are traveling, and they tell another kind of story, which is connecting people, which is, one of the forms of real fabric that connects the nature of this place. And it's also significant to say that those songs are mostly in Spanish. I mean, we're living in a place that has many indigenous languages and an important indigenous history, but we're in the state of Texas, but the dominant language here is Spanish. And this is a way of acknowledging that, and also trying to draw voices from the community, from people who these are all songs that are either about the river or about towns along the river. And so, and one of the songs from this list is also included in the book in Spanish, English, and in French. So it sort of indicates you could also investigate any of these individual songs for a mode of poetics and a form of representation.
Thank you. Yeah, this makes me also want to bring in the fact that because this exhibition also has a big life in France and in Paris, one of the essays in the book that's quite extraordinary is one that takes Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands La Frontera, which is a book that is a classic now, written in the 80s, 90s, and has influenced so many people, and where she writes through all her languages, right? indigenous as well as Spanish, English, and all of this. And it's really anyway, and the way the author situates it within Paris and within the EU. And so there's a whole other level of borders and a whole other discussion that this project, I mean, because of where we are, we've been focusing on it, but it's actually quite amazing to read that essay. And it just blew me away, all the different stories about Paris and the different, things going on. So again, that's my commercial for everybody to go out and get the book as well as run.
Can I interject here actually that the authors, plural, of that incredible essay are actually with us here today.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they're right there on this square right there. It's Catherine Facerias and Elisabeth Lebovici, who wrote this absolutely incredible genre-defying essay called Borderlong. Thanks so much for being with us here today. They've been incredible interlocutors for me for basically my whole adult life, but very much in this project. The conversations went really deep, and that essay in particular, because the exhibition, the first two venues were in Europe, it was just extraordinary to have these ideas fleshed out and applied to a kind of set of European border politics, border histories, and senses of identity, which is super beautiful. And that also calls to mind just one other thing I wanted to bring up, which is that we keep talking about the book and the kind of extraordinary, the three languages, and this layout. We worked with an incredible designer named Joseph Logan, who was our other collaborator on the book, both with Tim in the text volume and me in the image volume, who really took up the formal questions that Tim and I had about language and proximities of language and impossibilities of translation. And he really gave that a physical, graphic, design form that made it a comfortable home for this complex project. So I just want to shout out to Joseph.
Fantastic, thank you. Is there any, we want to open it up at this point to questions and discussions. So Chloe, I will send it over to you or is it to Eleanor?
No, it's me. I'm so, wow, that was incredible. Thank you all so much for that really astonishing and generous conversation. And we do have a few really wonderful questions. And so the first question actually is going to be from Anna Campbell. And Anna, I'm going to ask you to unmute here to ask directly.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It's such an exciting project, and to see even just a couple strands of it is so gratifying. And as always, Zoe, the work, it's deeply phenomenological, but it's also doing this heavy lifting around theory and politics. And of course, when we pull up those images where you're showing us the built environment around the river, it's doing something that I really appreciate the errancy conversation, so it's doing modernism wrong, but it's also, I feel like you're bringing other people down with you, like dragging the rest of, this whole, minimalist project along. And I know that that's probably in some ways one of the less ambitious parts of it, but I'm wondering how much that's also in your sightline.
Thanks for that, Anna. It's nice to see you here. The thing that pops to mind is this postcard that I found. And Tim's gonna knows what I'm gonna talk about. It's a postcard of a photograph from around 1910 of the confluence of the Devil's River and the Rio Grande. And the Devil's River runs clear The Rio Grande is a silt-filled river. So that's the back story. So this postcard that I found was this photograph, super beautiful. And on the back was just written, what is it? Half dirty and half clean. And there's something, the river runs half dirty and half clean. And it's a slightly longer sentence than that, but that was the really salient part of it. And I think that kind of gets to answer your question. I think the language of photography is one of our lingua franca right now. We all engage with photographs every single day as makers, as viewers. We're receiving photographs constantly. We're taking photographs constantly. It's such a muddy, form, right? There's nothing clean, there's nothing high. It's so mixed up. And within it are tangled all of these different histories, some of which are colonialist and extractive and incredibly violent, where surveying laid the groundwork for taking. But there are also histories of resistance and histories of subversion and histories of all kinds of the very best forms of errancy and mistake. So I'm really, I think the dirtiness of photography is what appeals to me. It's not, it'll never have the status of painting. It's just, it's photography. Oh. And I love that. I love kind of taking up this language that gets used every day in so many different ways and seeing whether it can produce meaning, whether we can be moved by it, whether we can find new ways to see, whether we can show each other different vantage points on our shared world. So that's kind of, does that answer it a little bit?
I would say, if you don't mind my saying real quick, also, it's like that when I talked about earlier about disciplinarity, poetry and photography are disciplines that a lot of people do. I've thought in my life that it would be worthwhile to have said I was a poet starting when I was a kid, just so that occasionally people would, as they have said, I also write poems. And of course, these things have, they have all these legacies, which we should talk about, but this sort of interesting fact of the permissiveness or the sort of promiscuity of these disciplines is the fantastic part of them, I think, right? Like they kind of have always messed with institutional forms in which they sort of might also sit.
Thank you so much for those answers, and thanks for that amazing question, Anna. The next question is going to be from GE. GE, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you so much, Chloe. And a question for Zoe. Do you believe your show, and of course the book then, offers like a way to reconsider our own habits of mind in the way that you have, that we have to wait for our eyes to adjust to various light levels when we look at something, the way the work then relies on us to change, on us to take our time to see what's right there before our eyes?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you. Yeah, I sure hope so. I mean, I honestly think that's like that's what art does, right? Like that's the amazing kind of time and space that art affords us, whether it's literature or painting, exhibition making, installation, this time that allows us to slow down and think about the world from a slightly different perspective, not in our daily task, but a moment to kind of reflect on who we are in relation to our world and who we may want to be individually and collectively. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Slow with the river.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another amazing question. We have a question that just came in from Monica in the audience. Monica, I'm going to give you an opportunity to unmute to ask it directly.
I hope I'm unmuted.
You
Hello,
are.
Zoe. Very nice to meet you and so many people of the team who worked on this exhibition, almost in person on the screen. It's a marvelous project, of which, of course, I've only seen a very small portion, as I now learned, at Hauser and Wirth. And I was fascinated by the concept of showing it in Paris and actually starting to show it in its full version in Europe rather than here in the US. And I wonder whether you know at all whether there were any differences in responses of both audiences, where of course, you know, there is a very significant border between South and North on the Mediterranean Sea and on Rio Grande. But both Paris and New York are geographically and culturally a little bit removed. So we both have certain understandings of this concept, of this context, and certain misunderstandings, or even a sense of exoticism. And I wonder how it played in Paris, how it played in here, if you even know.
That's such a great question. That's a tough one. I think I'm still learning about the responses. It's so new to have it in the world. I would love to show the work in its entirety in this country, and I would also love to show the work in its entirety in Mexico. But these were the invitations that I received. It was wonderful to show an excerpt of it here in New York. And I think I'm still hearing back from people how they responded, and I'm sort of still learning how the work is working in the world, if that makes sense. You know, something that's notable about New York, maybe that is different than Paris, is that although we are not near our southern border, we are on the water, and we are also within the the border line of the country. So we are actually like a place where people arrive. We're a port city. So it's a little bit different than Paris, but I think it's this, how do I say it? That the work toggles between being made in a very specific landscape, and observant of that landscape, and observant of those specific dynamics. And at the same time, in my mind throughout the making, I was like, well, how does this apply to the Nile? How does this apply to the Yangtze River? Or how does this apply to other borders? Do the same companies that construct these different sort of border infrastructure and surveillance devices, are the same corporations that make these materials? Do they build walls and detention centers in Palestine and Israel? Like there are global questions, I think, here that reflect no matter where the work is shown. And actually, it's going to go to Sydney next year, and I'm really, really interested to learn about that. Suzanne Cotter, who was the director at Moudon, and that really sort of championed this work and was the first person to show it with her team. I'm really curious, what are the conversations that are going to come up in Australia around indigeneity and land rights, the personhood of rivers, questions of drought, questions of colonial histories. And I think, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think what I'm really excited about, and I think Tim is also, and I think many of the book contributors, is what are the conversations that we can be part of? Can this artwork also be a location for conversations of different natures in different places? Can it be an instigator? Can it be a meeting place for us?
if I can just jump in at that moment, I think that's exactly what it is. I mean, I think that's what we've proven in this conversation, and also in all of the different instances. And it's going to have a long instance, different specificity location. Maybe somebody else has another question.
Thank you so much for that incredible question, Monica. And thank you for that really wonderful response, Zoe. The next question is going to be from Carolyn on the Rail team.
Hi, Zoe. Thank you so much for this talk. I know you talked a little bit about the beginnings of the project, but I'm sort of curious really where it started for you, if you feel comfortable sharing like on a more personal level, or I mean, questions of margins and center, I think, are really interesting when thinking about the border in photography and what's kept invisible kind of in such plain sight. That's what I'm thinking with my photographer glasses on, but I'm curious what led you to it in that way.
Oh man, that's a tough one. It's a great question, but it's a tough one because I could, I mean, how much time do you have? So trying to maybe answer it as succinctly as I can. I think I kind of had this moment of seeing the river as a potential subject, and thinking or feeling that everything I've ever been interested in as an artist could be explored here through this subject. I think maybe, for many writers or artists, like there are moments where certain works come out of a formal question, some of them come out of a personal experience. Artworks, they arise from all these different places. In this case, I was like, this is a great subject, like great with a capital G. I was like, oh my God, this river, its history and the way that we've interacted with it, paying attention to the course of this river and the human built environment in the riparian corridor, I can intersect with all of these different interests of mine, not only objectively sort of the issues of our day, but things that have been particular penchants of mine from the very beginning of my work. I was like, oh, there's trees and there's fences and there's water and I can be looking at all of these, the tensions between human built environments and the natural world, the way in which what we engineer reflects who we are, and then all questions about what does it mean to be a citizen? What are the limitations of citizenship? Where does that take you if you walk all the way to the very edge of what you're allowed to do as a citizen? What does that put you in? What situation does that put you in? That I learned a lot about what it means to walk to the edge of this country and what it is that we project to the rest of the world along that line. So an enormous number of kind of like images and subjects and concerns of mine all seem to be present here for me to explore. And I knew when it kind of came to me, which, there was like a moment where it's like, this is it. And I knew it would be really hard. I was like, okay, it's 1,200 miles and, it's a lot of desert and there's some areas that I knew, spent a lot of time in West Texas and certain parts of Northern Chihuahua. But I really didn't know the Gulf area, the Delta at all. But of course, the timing starting in 2016 and going through, photographing through the end of 2020, I had no idea how much more difficult it was going to become over the course of that time. And what it would mean in terms of personal kind of stamina to kind of endure working in a region that was heavily becoming increasingly more militarized and where often very, very tense, and in an area that was heavily surveilled. And I'm not going to go too far into it because it's well outside the realm of your question, but you know, the way that I chose to work was not, I didn't use any kind of remote camera apparatus. I didn't use any drones. I was working with a handheld 35mm camera for the bulk of the time shooting film, and working from public vantage points. So I didn't have to ask permission to be anywhere. These are things that I arrived at early in the project. So I was photographing what was in plain sight from ostensibly public access points to the river. But often, so I never crossed an actual do not trespass sign. But and once Tim began working with me a couple of years in and became a very important collaborator, we often found ourselves kind of working in this zone where it's not that it wasn't illegal to be there, but no one really wanted us there. And it could be a very intimidating environment with a lot of surveillance equipment and helicopters above, and really never being outside of the sight of Border Patrol agents. And so really working constantly in a very, you know, we were working in the open, but knowing that we were constantly being surveilled and having, you know, dozens and dozens of encounters with law enforcement daily. So it was, it started out with one set of ideas and interests, and me being kind of like, oh my God, this is going to be so great. and I don't regret it, but there were moments along the way where I wondered, and Tim and I also had long conversations about what we were doing and whether we were able to continue. Not having any background as an actual journalist or a war photographer, and like hats off to, you know, Susan Meiselas and like the, you know, people who are actually trained to function in those settings. I don't have the training or the stomach for it, to be frank. So it evolved. Let's put it that way. It really evolved.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that question, Carolyn, and for that answer, Zoe. The last question I'm going to ask on behalf of the Rails publisher and artistic director, Fong Bui. And that's for you, Zoe. Firstly, he says that he wishes you so much congratulations on the exhibition. He says, what I always find so compelling about your photographs, Zoe, is that the images, in spite of them being technical, are endowed with the poetry of intimacy. At times, they remind me of Via Selman's paintings. Have you ever thought of Via's work in any context, if at all?
I'm going to take that as the very, very highest of compliments. And yes, I think about Via Selman's work a lot, an enormous, enormous, enormous amount. She's a huge inspiration for me. It's the this process of observation that she engages in, and the kind of quiet, consistent, the consistency of her rendering that observation. She takes you through her mark making. She takes you through a process of observation. You can see through the pencil line or the woodcut. You see her seeing, and she packs every single drawing and every single print with the hours of close observation and all the thoughts that one may have while really looking closely at the world. And I think in her work there's poetry, there's politics, there's a person that's making it. You get to know something about her, not in a narrative biographic way, but you know something of how she sees and how she makes. She teaches us about patience. She teaches us about looking again and again and again, and that the process of looking and the ways in which we call attention to each other, the way we say, look at this, that shared language is also not only poetic, but it's one of the kind of most deeply satisfying human engagements we can have, is to share looking at the world together. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I just want to thank all of you so tremendously much for this conversation, and for all of your contributions to it today. Thank you. And at the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today we're thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Josephine Shokrian, to the stage. New York-based artist Josephine Shokrian works behind and between the scenes. Recent engagements include constructing wire sculptures and scenic design for a disabled dance company's performance on containment, producing a talking book from an archival text about illness under capitalism, and running a curricular lab on the politics and poetics of care. Shokrian's current work explores the relationships between voice, telecommunication, data surveillance, and disability, with support through an initiative of Leonardo, MIT Press, and Beale Center for Art and Technology, Claire Trevor School of the Arts at UC Irvine. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Josephine.
Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really excited to see the book, and especially to read Ariel Azoulay's essay. I'm so glad to know that there's this conversation around surveillance that's happening in this work. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about in terms of thinking around forensics and criminality, and the device of photography in terms of racist eugenics. So it's a really important conversation to have. I selected a text to read that is, I'm going to share my screen so that everybody can follow along. So just give me one moment, please. Okay, so I've titled this A Kira D, in the care of Pictures That Haven't Stopped. And this is a redacted poem of lines pulled while reading Love in Relief, which is a novel by Guy Okemkin, written in 1981. He was the French writer, philosopher, and queer theorist. This poem was first shared on Twitter in August of 2020 under the handle Gorge Babble. And I can try and drop this in the chat also if people want to follow along directly on the Twitter page. But I'll just say that this is a text around, the main character loses his vision in a motorcycle accident. And I thought it was a really interesting way of thinking about access and disability. So I'm really excited to read this with you all for the first time. A Kira D, in the care of. In the race to escape the sheets and girders of metal falling from the sky, someone crushed the little red device. A rosary reduced to the essential, sky without a horizon. Metallic lace, metallic plastic, metallic web, metallic clink. Polarized faces moving, orange lips with green shadows to announce unheard of misfortune. Women smiling songs in violet, sputtered yellow and blue hissing of synthetic music, and explosions by the hundreds, daughters of the great solar explosions, would ravage the nerves of the Earth's population. Bursting slow motion disco explosions, bursting hands, bursting ocular globe, bursting explosions at the end of revolvers. From cannons, tanks, boats, explosions are the only times image and sound ever perfectly coincide. I have a task to accomplish, to find the person who turned me into a living semiconductor. This run of frequencies is my visual identity, last visual memory, memory, not identity. The rest of me huddling, threatened with extermination. A frequency, a rhythm, a pulse, and a beat. The rhythm of a wave or of a living being, a hybrid being, an electromagnetic being was born in me. Oscillators sliding into other frequencies, frequencies, frequencies. I'd become a living radio receptor. It wasn't my brain sending me these codes, but some operator, maybe 1,000 miles away. I got lost inside or stuck in the visions of voluntary dreams. The surgeon suggested I create landscapes and people. I saw the covers of my bed move into volcanic eruptions when I moved my knee. I have seen the snow blue, then red, moving like the sea. I've never managed to find the set of commands that say unit off. Each imprint in a brain is a unique in the world, like a fingerprint upon the deep recesses of the eye. Now I mix in reds, flames. I'm like a sick person in a computer bath. Supreme torture, the image gets better every day, keeping me from feeling by forcing me to look. Indirect lighting that bathes my room. It is nighttime and they've put out the machine that does not sleep, the machine that does not have eyelids in front of the lens of its tireless camera. Black night is sometimes streaked with a brief runway electron. I see blackness. Even now I write in darkness to hide myself from what I cannot stop seeing. All I do is make the image sharper, more pitiless, cracking like a dying bee inside my skull, cracking the buzzing lulls, a dying bee inside my skull. The little machine that never left him. Scars of tear gas wrapped around the trees in the evening light. A chair with broken bracelets. I opened the blinds. The ape tangled up, white plastic plugs planted in the middle of a shaved pink. Blinds and double closed and soundproofed ceilings stopped all the ruckus. Blinds and double closed and soundproofed interior was silent and black. Pompino, Pompino. A gigantic turtle of cops slowly waddled their shields side by side, their long clubs dragging on the ground, ricochets off fire-resistant glass. Students constructing barricades out of televisions and computer terminals. That line between the paleness of the sky and the whiteness of the ice, a line which must be the horizon, a scar of images, inaudible and unfelt. Being on two sides of a sensation and the same time, of being the observer and the observed. When I touch one hand with the other, both are at once the subject and the object of sensation, slighted brain conventions, not images of the world. Sense for see, touch, but I'm also afraid of odors. I haven't the least modesty about noises. Resist music, not odors. Sentir, to smell, to sense, to feel, sense of presence. Sensations interlace. All the senses have their centers, but each center is a picture of what is happening in another center, whose echo reaches if more or less drowned out. Star maps. A face is a landscape. A landscape doesn't exist away from the panorama from which you contemplate it. All of which came to me in fragments. I dance only for myself. I'm the only one who can be my partner. Cut 2 holes in my neck, take a peek, word of the day, blinding light. No closer to east on a compass than yellow is to yellow, from one hand to the other as he spoke. Echo of the Mu'adin drifted. I know a certain portion of the sky, a home fire glowing in the hollow. How did this orientation manage to survive in dreams, cutting across the barriers of reality? How can you tell by looking at someone's face if they are seeing? cortical cecity, or peeling fruit, a term used for any act a person does without wanting to, yet wanting to. He had had me, wearing at least 5 slips, one on top of another. Shapeless and powerful, anonymous, the crowd again at last. Shape against my leg, the talk of a cane, the sonorous spectacle of a ticket window, brouhaha. She could not imagine me stepping outside dressed like an ordinary in the streets. American money is the worst. All the bills are the same size. 1 slip for the singles, 2 for the 5s, 3 for the 10s, and a little notch for the 50s. Completely evident that most of them would never be needed again. I could not have gotten lost, but escape. You cannot escape what I am. And what other world than the Institute would have me? I didn't have to spell out the word escape. How it was for 2 to explore the bars of our mutual cage. Surveillance is born from a passing glance, or from 2 glances passing. Thank you.
Wow. Josephine, that was incredible. Thank you so much. Like I need like a moment to recover. That was so beautiful and
Thank you.
incredible. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you so much.
That was incredible. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Thyrza. Thank you, Esther. Thank you again, Josephine. That was remarkable. And we'd also, of course, like to thank the team at Hauser and Wirth here in New York, who gave us a lot of help in making things possible for today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible. And they also support our growing archive. You can view today's event and our full archive on our YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events, like here on our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the writers, editors, and operations at the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., please do join us for a conversation with Tunji Adeni-Jones and Yassi Alipour on the occasion of the exhibition Emergent Properties at Nichols Gallery. We conclude with a poetry reading by Imani Elizabeth Jackson. And you can now turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much again for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you everyone for being
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
you
you.
so very
Thank
much.
you so much.
So good.